to Following Christ. And today we'll be speaking about current events again. We'll be speaking about what we've been hearing in the news and we've been hearing in our churches about the Russia and Ukraine dilemma. So, to get a perspective as to what's happening, okay, with Russia and the Ukraine, I have a guest speaker again, which is Casey, and he will share with you, okay, the current events that's happening, and he will put everything that's happening in perspective. So here's Casey.
Good afternoon, folks. How you doing? Yeah, I just wanted to make a few comments about the whole Russia-Ukraine situation. It's some things have been bothering me for quite some time, and this is going to be by no means an exhaustive dissertation on the matter, or I'd be sitting here for hours and boring you to death. So I'll try to make it as short and sweet as possible, sum up an ocean's worth of commentary into a drop, if you will. But to put things in perspective, I want you to imagine first a hypothetical scenario, because I believe this will really help understand the situation. Imagine, if you would, a global alliance made up specifically and only of a coalition of nations that were America's worst enemies and not any others. I mean, specifically the worst Islamic terrorist and communist regimes in the world aligned against us for the sole purpose of undermining and destroying the United States. I say a coalition of about a few dozen nations led by North Korea, China, and Iran, and all countries with very similar systems of government. Then say this coalition of nations led an armed military coup in either Canada or Mexico. And then, after overthrowing the government of one of those nations, they installed a puppet regime loyal to their cause and their global alliance. Then, this puppet regime, in cahoots with this coalition of nations, began putting bioweapons labs and missiles all along the United States border in either Canada or Mexico. Would you or would you not, at that point, want America to invade that nation and overthrow that government that was been installed in order for our own security and safety? Because through their actions, they have officially declared war on us. I think any sane American would say absolutely yes. We would want them to do that. Dare I say, with accuracy, that is exactly what NATO has done to Russia. And this did not just start this year. This war with Ukraine and Russia didn't start, earlier at the beginning of 2022 with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or even Russia's invasion of Crimea, a region of Ukraine, some years back. This began in 2013 or 2014. It was either 2013 or 2014, one of those years. But at that time, the Obama administration, of which Joe Biden, of course, was the vice president, and at that point had already had many personal illegal dealings in Ukraine, along with his son Hunter. They led, along with NATO in combination with the Obama administration and other global forces, both economically in the private and public sectors, as well as politically. They launched a coup in Ukraine. The duly elected democratic leader of Ukraine was overthrown in a military coup almost 10 years ago. And this man who's in charge now was installed there in his place. Vladimir Zelensky is not a democratically elected leader. He is an installed puppet leader of NATO who got there through an overthrow of the legitimately democratically elected government. That's something most people don't understand. The former leader, the one who was democratically elected, had a very good relationship with Russia, a very good working relationship with them. By contrast, Zelensky is extremely hostile. And the first thing he did after taking charge of power was close down all media outlets that were not friendly to him, imprison all of his political opposition, and literally make it illegal to speak out against him. He is the very epitome of a tyrant. There's nothing freedom-loving or liberty-pursuing about him. He's quite the opposite. He is a full-blown dictator. He is everything they accuse Putin of times 10. So he's not a freedom lover. He's, again, persecuted everyone who opposes him, puts all his political opposition in jail, and outlawed by all political parties except his own. So he outlaws all political opposition and closes down any voice or media by threat of imprisonment if they dare speak out against him. Does that sound like somebody we should be supporting? And it gets even better. In cahoots with NATO and the United States and the Obama administration, now the Biden administration, um, you, they were putting, and they continue to do so, bioweapons labs and missiles along Russia's border in the Ukraine. They had been doing that for some time. That was the original reason Crimea region of Ukraine was invaded back in 2014. And that is why Russia went into Ukraine earlier this year. So we must ask ourselves, who are the bad guys here? Who is on the side of righteousness? Who are the ones really at fault for this whole situation? Of course, because it was an invasion and this war has been prolonged, primarily because of the involvement of our government and NATO, there has been the tragic instances of innocent people being killed, being maimed, being harmed, the nation being destroyed. As is in the case with any war, there are horrific casualties in every way. And that's war itself. There's never been a war where that was good. There's no such thing as a good war in that regard. There's good causes for war, and there's justified causes to go to war. But no war does not. There's never has been a war that resulted in anything but death and destruction ultimately. So, of course, as would be the case in the hypothetical scenario I laid out before, if we were to invade Canada or Mexico under those justified circumstances, the same thing would happen there as what's happening right now in Ukraine. Casualties all over the place, cities being destroyed all over the country, property damage, not to mention the thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people, innocent people, men, women, and children being killed and being maimed in this horrific conflict. So I don't want to make light of any of that. But whose fault is this war? And I think it's reasonable to say that Russia was left no choice. What nation would tolerate a hostile foreign force taking over a nation that was friendly to them, installing a puppet regime, and then putting dangerous weapons right along their border? Who wouldn't respond in kind? So we need to put that in perspective. And we also need to keep in perspective because there's a lot of people who I admire and respect. A lot of people who, I would otherwise agree with them just about everything, spiritually, politically, and otherwise. Who I have nothing but the utmost admiration for, who I believe are horribly on the wrong side of this issue. I don't question their motives or their character. I think they're very good folks, but they are getting bad information, and that's what you're going to get from the media. If you're watching any mainstream corporate news outlet, including the so-called conservative ones like Fox News, you are not going to get the truth on this. You're going to get a filtered narrative, and certain facts will never be allowed to be stated. So it's important to find alternate sources of information on this. And it's also important to note what's really going on with Vladimir Putin in Russia. It's very easy for us, especially if you're in my generation, Generation X, or even the previous generation, the boomers, to view Russia as a villain because of our experience with them. We remember the Cold War. We remember the Soviet Union. We remember the evil empire it was during the 20th century. We remember that the Soviet Union was one of the most horrific, murderous, tyrannical regimes this world has ever seen. And we remember how America stood strong against it and the heroism of the greatest generation after winning World War II, winning the Cold War throughout their lives. And thank God that evil system collapsed, and there's still many like it around the world today. And dare I say, even our own is going in that direction very quickly. But the America stood as the force for good, as the force for righteousness, just as it had in the American Revolution when it gave birth to this nation, the end of slavery and in the Civil War, the defeat of Nazism and fascism in World War II, and the defeat of communism in the Cold War. America historically has always been a force for good and righteousness. Dare I say, we aren't anymore. And that's a hard pill to swallow. It's difficult for me to say and, painful to even acknowledge. But the reality is what it is. America no longer on the world stage is a force for good. We, and when I say we, I don't mean you or I personally or any particular individual or group in this nation, but as represented by our current leadership and our deep state and everything else, we as a nation are horribly on the wrong side, not just in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but in general. Um, we have been supportive of the most horrific Islamic terrorists. You look at Biden handing Afghanistan right back to the Taliban, and when Obama was in charge, handing the control of Iraq and half of Syria over to ISIS. We're aligning ourselves with the worst of the worst and actually leading opposition against causes for freedom. The Apple Corporation, of which is one of the largest American companies and is in complete cahoots with the current bureaucracy and regime and everything else. Apple recently shut down their AirDrop app in China when protests erupted against the Xi Jinping regime in China. So American companies, social media companies, are shutting down the voices and the opposition and the causes for freedom against tyrannical regimes like China. They actively support this murderous tyranny, just like they're supporting the corrupt, insanely corrupt regime in Ukraine, which is by far the most corrupt nation in Europe, and that's saying something. We must also really think about where we place Russia. Again, with our experience through our lifetimes, it's very easy to see them as the villain and, Vladimir Putin with devil horns. But if you really do your homework on this, Vladimir Putin, I'm not saying he's a saint. I'm not saying he's a great guy. He's used some very heavy-handed tactics in his own drive and for power and wealth, and continues to do so to maintain it. However, Vladimir Putin, his enemies are our enemies, whether you want to believe that or not. You look at the people opposing him: the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, Yuval Noah Harari, Bill Gates, the centralized bankers of the first world currency systems in Europe and America. These people, if you really delve into what they're about with the World Economic Forum, this isn't some conspiracy theory. They said it very openly. Okay, it's not a theory when it's being openly promoted in public. It's not a theory, folks. You can watch videos from the World Economic Forum where they actively promote a one world system that spells the end of private property. They literally say you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. Their plans are literally to hoard everybody into giant centers just in the big cities in a futuristic dystopian type of environment where there is no freedom of private property rights. There's no freedom of movement, and all the freedoms we've traditionally enjoyed in America, speech, religion, the press, assembly, are all gone. And if they want to install a global system of a corporatocracy, of centralized government control on a world scale with no more sovereign nations, owned and controlled by a handful of corporate regimes and their deep state operatives. I know this sounds insane, but don't take my word for it. Look for the World Economic Forum, look for their videos, watch what they do. They've publicized it, folks. This isn't theory. Now, what they do very creatively is they don't promote it. So you're not going to hear about this on CNN or MSNBC or even Fox News. It's manipulation by non-publication, if that makes any sense. It's out in the open, but it's not talked about. And they know that very few people are going to go out of their way to do their own research. Most of us don't have time. We have our own lives, our own things to worry about. So very few people are aware of what's really going on. But Ukraine is a big part of this. Though the global corporatocracy, The Antichrist system, if you will, is in full swing, and Ukraine is one of their hotbeds where they're implementing a lot of this stuff. Vladimir Zelensky is one of their puppets. By contrast, Vladimir Putin, who we're all supposed to hate, is standing against all this. Why do they hate Vladimir Putin? Is it because he invaded Ukraine? Gosh, no, not at all. Vladimir Putin is hated because he is a big roadblock to the agenda of the World Economic Forum and the globalist corporatocracy, the deep state initiatives, the big tech oligarchs. He's standing in their way. While they want to promote the most vile perversion imaginable, including the worst violations you could possibly do to the most innocent and vulnerable among us, our children, up to and including genital mutilation and outright rape. While they're promoting stuff like that, it's against the law in Russia. They will imprison you, and for the most worst offenses, they'll kill you, and rightfully so. While Christianity is being subversed and persecuted all over the world in the worst ways, and even here in our own nation to a degree, it flourishes in Russia. Now, I'm not saying they're all biblical, conservative, evangelical fundamentalists. No, they're not. The Russian Orthodox Church leaves a lot to be desired. They have a lot of heretical teachings and so forth, but you are not silenced. You are not shut down if you are a Bible-believing Christian in Russia. They have Bible reading and prayer in their public schools, in their public government functions. So, unlike the US and Western Europe, Russia is allowing Christianity to freely express itself and be heard and be promoted, while shutting down the extreme perversions of the Deviancy and Degeneracy Coalition, known as the LGBTQIA ad infinitum movement that we see. That's why they hate Vladimir Putin. He's also for national sovereignty. Vladimir Putin stands very strong on civilization states, meaning people returning to their customs, culture, and tradition, and then flourishing in their own right, and forming their own societies based on what their people need and what their people need, and how to expand national health and wealth by expanding national strength. He's very much in favor of the traditional family unit, as is many leaders in Eastern Europe, such as in Poland and with Viktor Orban in Hungary. These are people standing against the globalist system, against the New World Order, against the Antichrists. And Vladimir Putin is one of the primary ones. Again, I'm not saying the man is a saint, but I liken him to a Nebuchadnezzar or a Xerxes or a Darius, who are pagan kings in their own right with their own agendas and push for power and control and influence and wealth. But they let the people of God flourish. If you look at Darius or Nebuchadnezzar or Xerxes, they were very friendly to God's people and even defended them and became great allies of them. I see that in Vladimir Putin with Christians in Russia. Now, contrast that with, say, a Herod or a Nero, or an Ahab, or Jezebel, people who were specifically out to destroy all that was righteous and good, people who were just nothing but pure evil, and their whole aim was destruction and death. That is the World Economic Forum. That is the international banking cartel. That is the deep state operatives. That is unfortunately NATO and the UN and the European Union and the rest. NATO, I will say, is a prime example of what happens to a great organization with a great cause when it has outlived its cause. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was one of the greatest forces for good in the 20th century. They were on the front lines, led by the U.S., to combat the evil of communism, to stop the Soviet Union from expanding around the globe, to maintain freedom and liberty and Western civilization, which was rooted in Christian tradition and in biblical culture. That system accomplished its goal. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And at that point, NATO really had no reason to exist. But they continue to exist. And consequently, with their righteous cause accomplished, they did what happens to every good organization does that outlives its cause. They became corrupted. They they became, in essence, the opposite of what they once were. Now they are about promoting cultural Marxism. Now they are about promoting perversity. Now they are about promoting a socialist, centralized way of living. They are now promoting global governments and the opposition of national sovereignty. They are now pushing a global imperial system, which is quite frankly antichrist in every way. It's a hard pill to swallow, but we are, and I say we, I mean our national leadership, in cahoots with NATO and the UN and the EU. We are on the side of evil, folks. We're fighting for the antichrist system. Russia, ironically, is now standing against it, and so is much of Eastern Europe. They learned their lesson. We're now diving down the rabbit hole that they escaped from 3 decades ago. Vladimir Putin is public enemy number one to this antichrist system. And I think we need to understand that. And again, you're not going to get this, but you're not going to learn this stuff by watching mainstream corporate globalist media. That includes Fox News. For those of you who are conservatives who think they're on our side, they're not. The only one on Fox News who I would say is genuinely authentic, who's not afraid to tell it like it is, for the most part, is Tucker Carlson. And, which is why they're doing their best to try to cancel him. Thank God to this point of to none effect. But he's not afraid to speak powerful truths that other people are. And even he holds back a little bit. And dare I even promote at this time some media sources that you probably think belong in the trash, proverbially speaking. And quite frankly, I did too 5 or 6 years ago. Among them is InfoWars and Alex Jones. If you would have mentioned his name to me, Alex Jones, 6 years ago, or his online news source, InfoWars, you would have probably received a proverbial eye roll from me. If any commentary at all, I would have offered my opinion that he belonged in a straitjacket. I used to think he was completely out of his mind. And of course, he doesn't help himself with his antics. Alex Jones and other journalists on his network, they have a tendency to get pretty hyper, pretty passionate, and that's putting it mildly. They will yell and scream, pound the desk. There was that infamous viral clip years ago of Alex Jones talking about them making the frogs gay, and it led to many funny memes. But once you get past the symbolism, if you will, and get to the substance, get to the content of what he's saying, this man's been vindicated, whether people want to believe it or not. He was talking about InfoWars altogether, not just Alex Jones, but InfoWars in general. They were talking about Jeffrey Epstein's pedophile island back in 2010, when everybody else, including myself, were writing him off as crazy conspiracy theorists. They were talking about the World Economics Forum's plans and they had the video to prove it too, but I still thought they were nuts, ironically. That's how head in the clouds even I was back then, about their plans to manufacture a global pandemic and use it as a power grab and to centralize wealth, power, and control into the hands of a very few in a global oligarchy. I thought he was insane. The evidence is now clear. And what did they do? They shut him down everywhere. They're trying to bankrupt him into oblivion. And I'm not saying he's perfect or he's never made mistakes. Who is perfect? Who has never made mistakes? But I'll tell you what, InfoWars has been on the cutting edge of everything we've seen happen over the last 3-4 years. They've been talking about it for 10, 12 years. When somebody is consistently right and proven right about very serious matters, it's time to pay attention. And the fact that they're trying everything they can to shut that network down, the fact that you can't get it anywhere on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Well, Elon Musk did just allow Alex Jones back. Or no, he didn't. I'm sorry. He canceled him from there too. Yeah, they're not allowed on any major social media platform, and of course not in the media in general. If they try to shut somebody down, that tells you everything. Tyrants do not fear. Sorry, the dogs are making a lot of noise here. Tyrants don't fear lies, folks. They fear truth. And if you cut out a man's tongue, you don't prove that he was a liar. You just prove that you fear what he has to say. And oligarchs and tyrannical leaders have always used brutal means of silence in order to maintain their power, in order to shut down any opposition to what they were trying to do. And that's what you see happening, with the cancel culture all over the big corporate media and social media, and in cahoots with the deep state government operatives. So again, I know I'm getting down rabbit trails again. I have ADHD, sorry. But back to Russia and Ukraine. We need to be very careful and start thinking hard about what we support and what we oppose. And do your research, folks, as to who is standing for what and what people are standing against. Very recently, Vladimir Zelensky in Ukraine shut down all church activities that were considered Russian or related to Russia. Folks, that includes almost every church in Ukraine. He's basically outlawed church services in Ukraine. He shut down churches in Ukraine. Now, especially if you're more of a fundamentalist, you can say, "Oh, who cares? That's just the Russian Orthodox Church." You think that doesn't trickle down? It goes back to the old adage of the famous statement in World War II, where a Holocaust survivor said, first they came for the communists. I didn't stand up because I wasn't a communist. And they came for the Jews. I didn't stand up because I was a Jew. And he went through a whole list of everyone they came for, and he didn't stand up. He wasn't part of that group. And he said, then they came for me, and there was no one left to stand up for me. And that's, if he's shutting down every church, quote, related to Russia in Ukraine, which is the vast majority of the churches, what's he doing? He's shutting down all Christian worship. Is that a man we want to support? Vladimir Zelensky? Oh, by the way, he's also a very um, strong advocate of the whole, deviancy degeneracy coalition, otherwise known as LGBTQIA ad infinitum. He supports that very strongly. And Russia does not. Public acts of sodomy and the like are illegal in Russia. They haven't enshrined the redefinition of marriage into their law. In fact, it doesn't exist. It's still between a man and a woman. So if you're a believer in Christ, or you're a conservative for that matter of any kind, think long and hard before you decide that Vladimir Putin is the devil here, and that Vladimir Zelensky has a big halo around his head. There's a lot of things here that we need to take into consideration, and just be wise in what we decide to promote and what we decide to oppose. So I hope that was short and sweet enough. I got down a little bit of a rabbit trail, but there's so much I wanted to say, and I was just trying to hit the main points very quickly. Everyone have a good day. God bless, and I hope you'll ponder these thoughts. Take care.
So there you have it. Before we promote anybody, before we speak about any situation, I am big on getting informed. Okay, going through all the resources you can and study. I mean, a lot of people who are promoting and applauding a certain group are doing it without the knowledge of what's really happening behind the scenes. But how will you know what's happening behind the scenes? Like I stated before, research, research, research. So I hope you enjoy this. And I'll see you next week. And like I stated before, have a very Merry Christmas.